So if it hasn't already been this way for you, this current episode of HBO's limited series, We Own This City, is cranking up the intensity with building urgency and a very emotional backdrop. During his interview with the feds, former officer Maurice Ward recalls how Jenkins remained unscathed as the GTTF supervisor, despite a series of legal incidents. Steele confronts Chief Davis about a list of cops who lied in court, and the city is rocked by the Freddie Gray protests. I'm going to talk about some spoilers at the end of this, but I'll give a warning before diving into them just in case you want to bail before watching the whole episode. The last episode put a lot of focus on Jamie Hector's suitor, which I think was great to watch, but this episode finally drills down into John Bernthal's Jenkins in a way that is very focused. We already know that he was arrested by the feds for all of his corruption, but now we get to see so much of it in play. There's a sickening amount of alpha male syndrome going on with Jenkins. The bravado at which he conducts himself, it's just off the charts. And it's only made stronger because he's allowed to get away with all of the illegal activities that he perpetrates. We've seen little bits here and there regarding his corruption, but now we get to see it in great detail, thanks to all of the recounting done by former GTF officer Ward. I really enjoyed the interviews with Ward and how his story plays out. It's a different perspective and a dynamic so that it becomes an introspective character study. He's actually a very humble character, and his demeanor is very refreshing within what we see from the majority of those that are either arrested or under investigation. There's a building tension within the story that becomes almost palpable with how it gets under the skin, and then it worked to raise my blood pressure. The narrative is launching from one situation with Jenkins to another, each getting increasingly more aggressive and illegal in behavior. I'd liken it to someone who's on some sort of upper that is in a manic or frenzied stage, and then keeps taking more. Their excitability increases, their emotions get larger and larger, and they get more explosive. That anxiety is translated excellently by Bernthal through the screen. He's creating Jenkins to be an absolute powder keg of hubris, but with the backing of a gun and the assurance of his superiors that he's pretty much untouchable. It's frustrating from a human standpoint, but riveting as a story element. And this all comes to a head in the city within the story. Now, the show has constantly referenced Freddie Gray, but we've not seen really anything about it. That changes in this episode. The emotions are rightfully high and the showdown is intense, but right in the middle of that is Jenkins. It's a sickening viewpoint to watch, but it's also fascinating at the same time. This dude is so high on his adrenaline, and he certainly sees himself as some sort of hero figure. And so much so that even though he's not in the middle of any of the circumstances, when the protests start, he inserts himself. It's under the pretense that he's backing his fellow officers, but the feeling is that of extreme narcissism, that he needs to be included, so he does whatever he can to do so, and always also trying to be the great guy. He does what it takes to buy the loyalty or the admiration of his fellow officers. And that certainly parallels his entire behavior through the GTTF, which is one of the reasons that he ultimately gets investigated and arrested. The story is making sure to give us so many different scenarios and perspectives on Jenkins because he's charismatic, and it needs to ensure that we see the full picture of him, not just this law-abiding facade that he shows off. But this episode also continues to illustrate how it's not just Jenkins who's the problem. It's an endemic issue within so much of the leadership, which allows it to continue. And this then becomes a problem when it comes to prosecutions. I really enjoyed and found it highly intriguing when a small portion of the story focuses on the court system. Now, it's not in-depth, nor is it drawn out unnecessarily, but the points are driven home in ways that you can't miss, just about how police behavior in Baltimore directly affects court cases. While we as the audience can see the injustices and be annoyed or disgusted by what we see, it's good to also see more and more characters becoming frustrated with the situations that are caused by the behaviors of those in the BPD. This show continues to suck me in ways I don't expect. I find myself fully engaged and invested through every episode. The acting is superb, and I've really got to be sure that I separate John Bernthal from his character of Jenkins, because he plays the character so well, it would be very easy to just have that transference so that I become turned off by Bernthal in other roles, simply because he plays such a convincingly terrible and corrupt individual in this one. I love the pace of the show. It maintains a growing urgency to the narrative, but it doesn't rush the story. And the details are whole and complete, building out a very full storyline, complete with excellent character arcs. And despite so much information, and even timelines that do bounce around a bit, the story doesn't ever drag for me. Now we're 2/3 of the way through the series, so I'm really excited to see what the final 2 episodes hold. There's no sex, but some nudity, a ton of profanity, and a lot of violence. Now, as a reminder, I'm holding off my score until the finale when I'll give the show as a whole a rating. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into some spoiler territory because there are a few items that really stood out to me as intriguing that I would love to discuss with you. If you are hopping out now before I get to the spoilers, thanks so much for watching and for couching with me. All right, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode in the comments below. Did this one excite you or piss you off? Maybe both? So I think the biggest thing that this episode unveiled is the level of corruption with Jenkins that we now get to watch. I mean, and it gets worse when he makes sergeant and then the head of GTTF. Now I must be really naive because the first time he called a buddy cop to plant some evidence after that high-speed chase through the neighborhood yielded no guns or drugs, I mean, I was shocked. And also, how terrible is it that amidst Jenkins breaking the BPD rules about high-speed chases through residential areas, and then it ends with some elderly man dying? But I mean, the fact that they toss the car completely, come up with zero evidence of cash, drugs, guns. I mean, Jenkins's buddy, he just nonchalantly walks over to the car, ducks in, and then leaves. I mean, then the nerve of Jenkins to have Suter recheck the car so that he can maintain a level of distance from anything sketchy. And when that bag of drugs is found under the seat, I mean, it has the potential to harm the reputation of Suter and all the other officers because they supposedly searched the entire thing and it didn't turn up anything. I mean, it makes him look completely incompetent. And more importantly, though, I think it shows that Jenkins is corrupt and he knows other corrupt cops that he can call in favors from. We see this repeated when he ran that kid over and somehow flipped his car. Okay, now first, I really do have a lot of questions about how the car was upside down in such a tight street, but honestly, I mean, I quickly lost interest in those questions because I was instantly horrified and disgusted at the brazenness of Jenkins and his corrupt buddy who planted the weapon to incriminate the kid. And it's so reprehensible, and it just boiled my blood, and then it made me want to throw up on him. And all these scenarios work to show how corruption is prevalent through the BPD, not just within the GTTF as just this isolated incident. This then also plays into the courtroom scenario that Suter goes in and sits in. I mean, if you are in the US and you've ever tried to get out of jury duty, I mean, it used to be that you could just say that you were either friends with a police officer or that you believed they always told the truth. I mean, that was pretty much the golden ticket to be dismissed from a jury. What this episode shows is that the corruption and the abuse, it was so prevalent throughout the BPD that the majority of the public had drastically negative experiences with the police. I mean, not even just stories, and therefore they couldn't trust any police testimony or information. It's crazy to hear that the court couldn't sit a full jury of 12 after summoning something like 180 people. I mean, what they had at the end of the day, they had just seated 7 jurors. Holy crap, that speaks volumes about the behavior of the cops and then their effect on the community. And can we take a second to just address what Steele confronts the chief about? There are all of these known dirty and lying cops still on the payroll. I mean, it's proven that they've perjured themselves. So why the heck are they still employed? And none of the chiefs ever seem to do actually anything about it. They just blame their predecessors, but with inaction. I mean, they leave the dirty cops to continue to run rampant through the city. Now, finally, I really appreciated Ward's integrity. I mean, the dude took part in dirty cop behavior, but I was really impressed at how he put all of the money back in the duffel in Jenkins's trunk, and then even more impressed at the final shot of the episode where there are those stacks of cash just tossed in the woods. Now, I took them to be Wood's share from the massive seizure that happened in the basement of that dude's house that Ward just refused to keep. So what else stood out to you in this episode? How are you liking the show so far? I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.